Hey, so I've had some friends that have asked me if I could show them how I make my whole wheat bread, and I thought I would demonstrate that today. I make 6 8.5 by 4.5 by 2.5 inch loaves at a time, and if this is too much for your family, you can make this recipe and then freeze the extra loaves that you aren't going to use right away because they freeze really well, or you can scale back the recipe and just make 2 loaves at a time. I make my bread in a Bosch mixer. You can make bread in a stand mixer, but I wouldn't suggest making more than about 2 loaves at once, as it's probably going to burn out your motor over time. But yeah, I make 6 loaves at once. You could also knead these by hand if you were interested. So I'm going to start by adding in 9 cups of whole wheat flour. So now I've got in my 9 cups of whole wheat flour, and I'm going to next add 2.5 tablespoons of instant yeast, not active dry, but instant yeast. Next, I add half a cup of high gluten flour, and since I'll be using 14 cups approximately of whole wheat flour in the end, I also use dough enhancer, and you generally use about 1 teaspoon of dough enhancer per cup of flour. So I'm going to use about 5 tablespoons roughly of dough enhancer. The dough enhancer and the high gluten flour are optional though. You can make the bread without it and it will turn out just fine. And my next step is to add 6 cups of very hot water. I like my water to be between 120 to 130 degrees, and I use a digital thermometer, as you can see, to make sure I get the temperature right. And I'm going to need to stick this measuring cup in the microwave and heat it up a little bit, or you could get some water from your tap if you have water that hot. So I've heated my water up to a temperature I'm happy with, and I'm going to go ahead and turn on my mixer for about 10 seconds just to get the yeast and the ingredients mixed a little bit so that the yeast, well, I don't know that it would get killed by having that hot water come right on top of it, but I just like to mix it in a little bit first, about for 10 seconds. Okay, it's mixed, and now I'm going to add the water. So I've added the 6 cups of water, and now I'm going to put the lid on my mixer, and I'm going to go ahead and mix it for about 1 minute and then turn it off. Okay, so my dough has been mixed for about a minute, and now I'm going to replace the cover on the mixer and allow the dough to sponge for about 10 to 20 minutes. It's kind of like an initial rising where you just let the dough rest for a little bit and begin to rise. So we'll come back in about 10 to 20 minutes. All right, it's been about 20 minutes and I feel like the dough has sponged nicely. I know that my yeast is active, so I'm going to go ahead now and add in half a cup of oil. I use canola oil, but vegetable oil is perfectly fine. And I purposely add my oil first so that the residue of the oil is left behind in my measuring cup, so that when I next measure my honey will just slip right out of that measuring cup. So I'll first add half a cup of canola oil and then half a cup of honey. All right, I've added my oil and honey, and as you can see, it's pretty full in there. So I'm going to turn on my mixer for just about 5 seconds to get that mixture down in the mixing bowl. And now I'll be adding 1.5 tablespoons of salt. Okay, and then from here on out, I will just be adding 1 cup of whole wheat flour at a time, turning on my mixer and mixing it in, and just keeping an eye on the texture of the dough. The goal here is to get the dough so that it just pulls away from the sides of the bowl and leaves the sides of the bowl clean, but you still want the whole wheat dough to be quite sticky. After adding the salt, I added in 1 cup of whole wheat flour and turned on the mixer for about 15 seconds. It's incorporated a bit. It is very sticky at this point, so I'm going to add in another cup of whole wheat flour. All right, at this point I have 11 cups of whole wheat flour in the mixer bowl, and I'm going to go ahead and use a spatula to just run it around the sides of the bowl to get all of these extra bits off, and then I'll add in another cup of whole wheat flour and mix for another 30 seconds or so. Okay, I now have 12 cups of whole wheat flour mixed in, and you can see that I still have bits of dough that are clinging to the edges of my mixing bowl, so I'm going to go ahead and add in another cup of whole wheat flour. Okay, this is looking pretty close. I have added 13 cups of whole wheat flour at this point, and I did also add that additional half cup of high gluten flour back at the beginning of the process, so I have about 13.5 cups. I'm going to put in another half cup and just see how well that cleans up the side of the bowl. The goal is to use the least amount of flour possible to have the moistest, yummiest bread. We don't want to dry this out here. So I'm going to try it with a half cup more and see what it looks like. So at this point, I feel pretty good about how my dough looks. I feel like it's cleaned up really well from the sides of the bowl. The very top of the mixing bowl has some bits of flour and honey where the dough hook can't reach it, but I'm all right with that. I think that the dough looks good. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and let the dough mix for about 5 minutes. And while it's mixing, I'm going to prepare my bread pans. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I use 6 8.5 by 4.5 by 2.5 inch pans. If you were to use larger baking pans, that would be fine. You'll just want to make sure that the amount of dough that you put in your baking pan fills up the pan about halfway. One other thing that I really like to do with this bread dough is to form rolls. If I don't need a lot of rolls for dinner, I might just use a 8-inch round cake pan and oil the cake pan, and I'll drop in about 7 portions of dough. And the size that I make the dough are slightly larger than golf ball size. And I'll just place 6 around the edge in a circle and 1 in the middle, kind of like a flower, and cover that with a clean dishcloth and allow it to rise until it's double in size. And then I would bake that for about 25 to 30 minutes in a 350-degree oven, just until the tops are golden. But today I'll be making 6 bread loaves, and so I'm going to show you how I oil my bread pans. One other thing I forgot to mention with the rolls, if you'd like to make more rolls, you can oil a 9 by 13 inch baking dish and go ahead and place in about 12 of the slightly larger than golf ball size balls of dough, and cover that and let it rise. And follow the same baking instructions as I just told you for the smaller amount of rolls. Okay, so in my loaf pan, I've put in about a tablespoon or so of oil, and I'm just going to use my hand, my clean hand. If you want, you could use a spatula or a cooking brush and just make sure you get it all across the bottom, in the corners, and up the sides of the pan. And I'm going to do that for all 6 of my bread loaf pans. And then I'm going to leave a little excess oil. I usually have a little bit extra that I pour out of the pans after they've been oiled, and just keep it in a little bowl next to me. And I'll use that to oil my hands as I pull the mixed dough out of the mixing bowl, because it's very sticky, and that will help it not to stick to my hands so much as I form it into bread loaves. Alright, so my dough has been mixed now for about 5 minutes. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and divide it evenly among my bread pans. I did just want to mention that you may use a little bit less or a little bit more flour based on how humid your kitchen is. But the point or the goal that you have is to try to get the dough just to clean the sides of your mixing bowl. You do want it to be sticky. So I'm going to go ahead and divide it evenly among my bread pans. Okay, so I have my bread divided among the 6 loaf pans, and I'm going to go ahead and just cover it with a clean dish towel and let it rise until it's about double. Depending on how warm your kitchen is, this could take anywhere from about 30 minutes to an hour. Oh, and one tip, you might just want to lightly oil the tops of your bread loaves so that the dish towel doesn't stick. You could also use a long piece of plastic wrap over the top of them as well. But just make sure it's loosely draped over it so that there is room for the bread to expand. So my bread has risen about double in the pan, so I'm going to go ahead and place them in a 350-degree oven on the middle rack for 30 minutes. All right, so the bread is coming out of the oven. I give it a couple of little taps to loosen it and bring it out of the bread pans, and then I put it on some racks to cool. Ooh, a little bit stuck. But if the bread doesn't come out easily, I leave it in the pans. Even though it steams a bit, after about 10 minutes it will come out easily. And then once it has cooled, you'll never know the difference, that it wasn't hard and crisp like the first ones that came out on the outside, but nice and light and fluffy inside. And you're going to want to let the bread cool for about 30 minutes before you cut your first slices. It will keep its shape a lot better if you do that, but your bread should be thoroughly cooled in a couple of hours, and you can place it into bread bags at that time. Okay, I have all 6 loaves of bread out of their pans and cooling on wire racks. A couple of the loaves did give me some trouble. I had some difficulty getting them out of the pans. I just allowed them to sit a little bit longer, about 10 minutes, and then I tapped them again on my hot pads and they came right out, and here they are cooling. If I can get my family to wait a couple of hours, that would be ideal, but we'll probably be slicing into these in about a half hour.